Well, today I want to begin our time by telling you a story. And here's how the story goes. Back in the day, a guy and a girl from two different towns got married. And at their wedding reception, the groom told a riddle to some guys from the bride's hometown and made a bet with them that they couldn't solve it. And so the guys approached the bride, and here's what they said. Hey, I know y'all just got married, but we need you to get your husband to tell you the answer to this riddle, and then you can tell us. And if you don't, we're gonna go kill your parents, okay? So naturally, the bride goes and she begs her husband for the answer, and he caves. Then she did as she was told, and she gave the answer to the guys from her hometown. And so they solved the riddle, and they won the bet. Now, the groom was unhappy about this. He lost his temper, and he ended up killing a bunch of people and then left town. Now, maybe that was a bit of an overreaction, but the bride's dad literally was quoted for saying, wow, that was the worst wedding reception ever. And he assumes the groom is gone for good. So he gives his daughter to be married to somebody else. But after a little time passes, the groom comes back and he asks the wife's dad, hey, where's my wife? The dad says, well, I thought you were gone, so I gave her to be married to somebody else. Why don't you marry her younger sister? She's a whole lot more attractive anyway. But the groom isn't having it. He captures a bunch of foxes and he lights their tails on fire. Now, this is animal cruelty at its finest. And the foxes run around and their tails are on fire because, well, they are. And as they run around, they end up starting a wildfire that burns down all kinds of grain and vineyards and olive groves in town. Now, as you hear that story, you probably say, that is a bizarre, weird, and crazy story. And the truth is, you're right. But believe it or not, that particular story is actually in the Bible. Now, it doesn't read exactly the same way that I told it, but the basic plot is all there. And it's found in the book of Judges, specifically chapters 14 and 15, which is in the Old Testament. And maybe you're wondering, well, what does that story have to do with my life today? And that's a very valid question. Because the last time we met, we started a conversation about the Bible. And we said that the Bible points to God and helps us to know God. And we also said that when, we read the Bible, it can be confusing, which we understand. And reading the Bible is kind of like, putting on, different glasses that don't really make sense. But when we read the Bible with Jesus in mind, it's kind of like putting 3D glasses on. He makes it clearer. But what about the stories like the ones we just read? What does that have to do with Jesus? Maybe you were even surprised that story came from the Bible because you've heard plenty of other odd Bible stories. Or what about the Bible stories that are just straight up unbelievable? Those stories that seem to go against everything that you seem to have learned in science class. Maybe, things like, talking snakes and donkeys, or somebody getting thrown overboard and swallowed by a big fish and living to tell the tale. Or a few loaves of fish, or a few, loaves of bread and a few fish literally multiplying to feed thousands of people. And we could go on and on. And then there are the parts of the Bible that feel incredibly outdated and even offensive, like the laws in Leviticus against wearing clothes made of two different kinds of fabrics. So if you're wearing a cotton and polyester blend, you're in trouble. As outdated as that seems, it seems harmless enough, right? But what about the parts of the Bible that just seem violent and unjust? Confusion, doubt, bother. It's okay to feel all of those things. And you're certainly not alone if you do. Now, sometimes there is a disconnect between what we're told about the Bible and what we actually experience when we read it. We're told that the Bible helps us to know God, and that we can get to know God if we practice hearing from God through His Word. Now, just imagine what your connection to God would be like if you practice this every day. But what if you read it and you're left feeling confused, doubtful, or bothered? What's missing? What do we need so that we can see God and God's story in all of the Bible? Now, while we're not going to be able to tackle each odd, unbelievable, or troubling part of the Bible, The good news is that there's something that can help us understand the Bible better. And that's this idea of context. Now, context creates clarity. And the good news is we're already on our way to get a grasp on the context of the Bible. Now, last week we looked at the Bible's table of contents. And when we did, we saw that there were different parts that combined together to tell God's story. A story where God is the main character and where Jesus most clearly shows us who God is. Because remember, the purpose of the Bible is to help us to know God. And knowing the purpose of the Bible is the first big step in knowing the context of the Bible as a whole. Now let's talk a little bit more about the different parts of the Bible. You might remember the Bible's divided into two different sections. There's the Old Testament, the beginning of the story of God's relationship with God's people. And then there's the New Testament. The story continued with the life, death, resurrection of Jesus and the beginning of the church. Now from there, each section is divided into several different writings that we call books. Now remember, there are 66 books total, and the way they all work together to tell God's story is a really unique way. For example, some books are full of poetry and praise, and others are full of laws for God's people. There are some books that record historical events, and other books that have a lot of advice for right living. There are plenty of letters to and from different people all over the world, and it's really quite a collection. It's no wonder that sometimes we're really confused when we read the Bible. Now, all of the books of the Bible are bound together in one cover, but the Bible isn't just one book. When we open up the Bible and start reading it without understanding that we're reading one of the 66 unique documents, we're missing something huge, which is the idea of context. Context matters. It changes how we understand everything we read. Sometimes it's helpful for me to think of it this way. I'm not reading a book, I'm reading a letter written to a specific group of people living in the first century. Or I'm not reading a book, I'm reading pieces of wise advice that a father wrote down for his son. Maybe I'm reading a history book, recording everything that happened. Maybe I'm reading a song written to God by someone who actually knew God really well. Maybe I'm reading an eyewitness account of someone who actually hung out with Jesus. So, we're going to look at two passages, and the first is from 2 Timothy. And this is what we know about the context, is that it's called 2 Timothy because it was the second letter written to a guy named Timothy. Now, the Apostle Paul, who was a mentor and a close friend of Timothy, was the one who wrote this particular letter. And Timothy was a pastor of a church in Ephesus, a church that was full of people who were struggling with all kinds of things. And here's what Paul writes in 2 Timothy chapter 4. Only Luke is with me. Bring Mark with you when you come, for he will be helpful to me in my ministry. I sent you Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, be sure to bring the coat I left with Carpus at Troas. Also bring my books, especially my papers. Now, context makes this make sense. Paul left his jacket. He wants Timothy to bring it back. We know this because this passage comes from a letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. Now, let me give you a second example. If you've been around the church for a while, then you've potentially heard or read this popular verse. It says, "For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength." Now, we read that, we know that verse, we've heard that verse. With no context, this verse can mean about anything we want it to mean. We could say, well, I can dunk a 10-foot basketball goal through Christ who gives me strength. I can pass my math class without studying through Christ who gives me strength. I can go viral on social media through Christ who gives me strength. Now, with no context at all, this sounds like with Jesus, we can live the life of our dreams. But does it mean what we really think it means? Here's where context really helps. Because this was also a letter that was written by Paul. But this time it was written to an entire church. Now, imagine if one of our small group leaders moved to take a job in another state, and then they wrote our student ministry a letter to read out loud during youth group. This is kind of what the relationship would be like between Paul and this church. But there's more. Paul wrote to them from prison after being arrested for his faith. And in this part of the letter where the verse is, Paul was thanking them for sending him some financial support and acknowledged their kindness. And at the same time, he assured them that they didn't need to feel obligated to send him more money, because Paul lets them know it's going to be okay whether he has a little or whether he has a lot. He's like, I've had a full stomach and I've had a hungry one, and I've learned to be content either way. So this section of Paul's letter is really about contentment. And Paul is letting them know he's figured out how to be peaceful and content with his life, whether life is going good or it's going bad. As Paul's writing this letter, things really aren't going good for him. And so how can Paul find contentment, even as he writes from prison with very few things going his way? How can he write this verse, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength? It's simple. It's because Paul was dependent on Jesus. His close relationship with Jesus gave him the power and the strength to persevere and to find peace even when things were tough. Paul was dependent on Jesus. His close relationship with Jesus gave him the power and the strength to persevere and to find peace even when things were tough. So the meaning of this verse isn't open-ended. It's not about breaking your personal record. It's not about saving up for a car or winning the big game. It's more like, because Jesus gives me strength, I'm going to be okay whether I have a little or whether I have a lot. Whether life is going my way or not, I can turn my attention towards Jesus and find peace even when I'm hurting. You see how the meaning of this verse becomes clear to us once we look at the context? And because we understand what Paul is saying to the Philippian church, we can actually take the next step and think about what it means for our lives. In other words, you could say it this way, that context creates clarity. Context creates clarity. Now, let me give you an example of this. Let's say you're walking the halls at school and you happen to find this particular note on the floor at school. And I know it's hard to read here on the camera, and I know that people really don't write notes to each other, but on this particular note, it has the inscription that says, "Stop being a bully." Stop being a bully. And maybe, you say to yourself, well, okay, I've already stopped acting like it, and I've already said that I'm sorry. Why can't you just drop it? Well, if you were reading this note that was written maybe for you, would you just drop it and say, am I acting like a bully? What is it that I need to drop? No. You might be reminded that nobody likes to be bullied. Or maybe you would understand that the note was written for somebody else. Or you would assume that somebody at your school had a beef with somebody else. And so you would accept the fact that you probably may not ever really know what went down. So here's the thing, and why do I give you that example is because we tend to do the same thing with the Bible. We open it up, we find a random verse, we don't know anything about the verse's original context, like who wrote it, when they wrote it, where they wrote it, or why they wrote it, but we try to make sense of it based on the context that we are currently in. And when several people do this with the same verse, we end up with all kinds of different, even contradictory meanings. This happens all the time. People take a verse out of context and they put it into their own context to make it mean what they want it to mean. Now, this also means that we must be aware of our context. Our own context determines our perspective and the way that we understand the Bible. But to know what the Bible is really saying, we need to try and read it from the perspective of who it was originally written to. Now, I've heard it explained this way, that the Bible was written for us, but not to us. It was written for us because God knew all along that we would be born to live at a point in time where it was God's plan to give us these writings to help us through the things that we've been going through. And it's been passed down from generation to generation. But at the same time, the Bible was written thousands of years ago in a culture context that was very different than ours. And if we want to know what the Bible's saying, we have to ask the question, what did this mean for them in their context back then? And once we know that, then we can ask ourselves, what does this mean for ourselves in our context today? Now, earlier we acknowledged that some parts of the Bible seem really odd or unbelievable or kind of troubling. Maybe there's a specific passage or a verse in mind that just doesn't sit well with you. And knowing the context of those difficult passages can help us make sense of them. So keep asking questions, keep looking for answers. It's worth noting that some parts of the Bible describe what life looked like back then, but they're not describing what life should look like today. And let's not forget that all of the Bible is telling one story, a story of God's love for all people. And when you read the Bible, even the difficult parts, read it with Jesus in mind. Because if we forget that the point of the Bible is to help us know God, and we don't know the context of what we're reading in the Bible, then we're just taking our best guess at what it actually means. And since the point of the Bible is to know God, then we don't just want to mess around with what it's saying. It's worth it to spend the time doing the work, studying the verses, to learn the context and get the clarity, because God is worth it. So the next time you come across a part of the Bible that you don't understand, try asking these questions. Who wrote it and who was it written to? Sometimes a passage doesn't make sense because we don't understand who the audience is. So start there. Secondly, why was it written down? 2 Timothy was written to encourage a friend in his leadership as a Christian. Philippians was written to remind a group of people that they were loved by God, and Paul was loved by God, who was the author of the letter, and to encourage them to keep following Jesus. When you can figure out the why it was written, it makes more sense. It makes more clarity, evident, and it also helps you understand it better. And then what made people think this information should be written down or saved? What impact could this have on the first people who heard it? And then finally, is it helpful to me or not? You see, the whole Bible is important, but not all parts are equally as helpful in every moment of every day, and that's okay. A tip could be to read a passage of Scripture until you bump up against something that is helpful and stop there. Think about it. Maybe write down a few thoughts about it on why it's helpful and what you plan to do with it. You see, the Bible is a gift from God to help us know that God is there, and to help us know God, and to help us become the person that we were created to be through the process. But for that to actually happen, we need more than just to, close our eyes and open to a random page and start reading the first words that we see. Because the Bible was written in a different time and a different place, we will be confused sometimes. But I need to understand that context creates clarity. And clarity helps us find God in every story and on every page. And it's impossible to find God and not be changed for the better. So what if you and I made the decision, despite sometimes feeling confused, to look at the Bible with courage? Instead of giving up when things don't make sense, let's remember the prize of knowing God and put in the effort to learn about the context of the Bible. Ask God to give you the curiosity to uncover the meaning of what it is that's in the Bible. Well, thank you so much for checking out part 2 of our series, Table of Context, as we continue to journey through what the Bible says for us. Remember that the Bible is helpful to help us know God, but it may be confusing at times, and so we need context to help us understand that. And maybe as you read through Scripture, you need to remember those 4 questions that we looked at today. And if you missed them, I encourage you to go back in the video and check them out. They'll be up on the screen next to me here. But I encourage you to check those out as you read through the Bible and help learn more about who God is and how the Bible applies to your life today. We'd love to see you in person. We meet every Sunday night from 6 to 8 p.m. in the youth room at New Hope Church. We'd love to have you join us in person as we continue next week with this series. Table of Context, as we look at the Bible. We'd love to have you join us in person. Have a great and wonderful rest of your day and an amazing week, and we hope to see you soon.